In 1997, in the shadow of the Acropolis, a remarkable discovery was made. Amid the traffic and noise of modern Athens, construction workers uncovered the ruins of the Lyceum, a school established by the great philosopher Aristotle over 2,000 years ago. But what they unearthed was more than just the foundations of an ancient building. It was the place where Aristotle laid the very foundations of Western thought.
No other philosopher has ranged so broadly over so many topics, made so many discoveries, and set the world on its ear forever with what he said, for good or ill.
Throughout his life, Aristotle examined fundamental questions about what it is to be human and what it is to live a meaningful life. His questions and the methods he used to explore them remain with us today.
The terms that we use, the concepts that we employ, are due to Aristotle or were developed in rejection to Aristotle. So simply to understand who we are, it's important to understand Aristotle.
To understand Aristotle and his lasting legacy, we have to go back to Athens, back to the Lyceum, back to the time when Aristotle set out to know the world. Greece, 367 BC. At the age of 17, Aristotle left his home in the provincial city of Stagira and headed south to the thriving metropolis of Athens. As a young man and through the course of his life, Aristotle was driven by his insatiable desire for knowledge. It was this desire that drew him to Athens.
Athens was the intellectual center of Greece at the time that Aristotle arrived, and it was roughly the New York of the ancient world. It's where you went.
Aristotle had come to Athens for a formal education, something he considered critical to the living of a meaningful life. He would later write,
"The educated differ from the uneducated as much as the living from the dead."
Aristotle chose to study with the greatest philosopher of the day, Plato, at his renowned school known as the Academy. The son of a doctor, Aristotle had a scientific approach to the world. But while at the Academy, he became curious about the questions Plato and his students were asking, questions that were far outside the realm of science.
What human beings are fundamentally like at bottom, what they care about, what they hope and fear, how best to organize cities and states so that the society is just, and what the goal of human life is.
These topics were transforming the very landscape of philosophy. In the years before Aristotle arrived at the Academy, Plato and his mentor, the great thinker Socrates, had redirected the focus of philosophical thought.
Prior to the time of Socrates, most philosophy was speculation about the cosmos. It was the big scale, astronomy, the nature of the universe, how many elements are there composing everything in the world. Socrates wanted to ask questions about what it is to be a good person, what it is to live a meaningful life. Socrates used to stop strangers on the street in Athens and say things like this: "Man of Athens, you're a citizen of the greatest city in the history of the world. Why is it all you care about is wealth and fame? You never give any attention to the state of your own soul." For Socrates, this life is all about the state of your own soul.
Plato built on Socrates' ideas, believing our day-to-day lives should not be the focus of our attention. For Plato, our world was merely a flawed version of an ideal reality. He believed truth could only be found by contemplating that reality, even though it would always be out of reach. This thinking intrigued the young Aristotle.
Actually being in the presence of Plato must have been incredibly inspiring. And it's very clear that for Aristotle, and his contact with Plato was the central, fundamental event in his life.
Under Plato's guidance, Aristotle explored the fields of mathematics, rhetoric, ethics, and politics. And most important of all, he learned to carefully analyze and scrutinize everything he studied. This training would become the cornerstone of his later work. But while at the Academy, Aristotle used this training to challenge the work of his teacher.
Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth.
Aristotle started rebelling the way any really good student does when he found some of Plato's views to be more rooted in hope than in logic.
Aristotle took issue with Plato's focus on an ideal, unattainable reality. For Aristotle, answers could be found in this world, in our everyday lives.
Plato was a poet. Plato was a visionary. He was a literary man. He was an otherworldly thinker. Aristotle was very much his father's son. He was a physician. He was a man of science, a man of research.
He's the one who's much more down to earth, much less captivated by otherworldly ideals. And there's a famous painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. In the foreground, you see Plato talking to Aristotle. Plato is holding a copy of his dialogue, the Timaeus, and his hand is pointing up. Aristotle is looking at Plato and his hand is cupped, pointing down. This is supposed to indicate the basic difference between the two.
You could basically say the teacher and his pupil, Plato and Aristotle, captured those two differing philosophies of life, the otherworldly and the thisworldly, that have vied for dominance throughout all of human history.
For thousands of years, these two philosophies would compete most fiercely in the realm of religion.
Plato was appropriated by lots of religious thinkers who wanted a justifying philosophy for an otherworldly concern, a transcendental set of values that viewed this life as only a way station to another, more important, greater form of existence. For a long time, that philosophy dominated the West. It was only gradually that the this-worldly concerns of Aristotle came into their own.
Some of Aristotle's basic doctrines provided a great challenge to Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. For instance, Aristotle denied the resurrection of the body and also did not think that anything individual survived after death. This was a sore point for centuries. Nevertheless, parts of Aristotle's description of the nature of the world and part of his description of human nature was taken over by all three traditions.
In spite of the philosophical differences between student and teacher, Aristotle spent 20 years at the academy.
He became Plato's star pupil, and in a very short time he was seen as a great philosopher in his own right.
But when Plato died in 347 BC, to the surprise of many, he didn't leave the academy to his star student. It was a turning point for Aristotle. With the top job at the academy denied him, he decided to leave Athens and set out to explore the world. While traveling through Greece and Asia Minor, Aristotle reconnected with his abiding interest in science and turned his attention to biological research.
He was a great experimental biologist. He was a wonderful zoologist, described many animals in spectacular detail. And in some of his biological writings, he considers an objection to what he was doing. Isn't it beneath the worry of a philosopher to think about the internal parts of disgusting creatures like insects and worms and so on?
Aristotle defended himself and his this-worldly focus in a work he called Parts of Animals.
We should not childishly complain against the enquiry into the less worthy animals, for in everything natural there is something marvelous.
With Aristotle, for the first time in history, the study of nature was systematically organized. He categorized numerous plants and animals into species and genera, scientific terms that remain with us today. It was a groundbreaking approach that laid the foundations of modern science. Nevertheless, many of Aristotle's theories were, in the end, inaccurate. He argued that the brain was responsible for cooling blood, that the earth was at the center of the universe.
One thing we have to remember about Aristotle is he was asking scientific questions without scientific instruments in his time. It's remarkable that he was able to ask the questions, not remarkable that he came up with some false answers.
By asking challenging questions, Aristotle earned a reputation throughout the Greek world as a brilliant scholar. So much so that in 343 BC, the greatest ruler of the time, Philip II, invited Aristotle to tutor his son, Alexander. Alexander would go on to lead his troops in a spectacular military campaign through Egypt to India and earned the name Alexander the Great. History would remember Alexander as a brilliant, if tempestuous, leader who spread Greek culture throughout his vast empire. But when Aristotle arrived, Alexander was just a strong-willed boy of 13 needing an education.
Even though there was some rebellion of the young student against his master, as there had been in the case of Aristotle and his teacher Plato, you still find deep and profound influences Aristotle had on Alexander. I think Alexander's vision for big things, but his attention to small details, reflected Aristotle's bifocal mentality, that focus on the big without neglecting the small. It's even said by many historians that Alexander had his soldiers send back any interesting plants or animals they found on their conquests to the philosopher.
After studying with Aristotle for 7 years, Alexander ascended the throne and ended his formal education. It was time for Aristotle to head back to Athens, a city that was still the intellectual heart of Greece, but was now under the control of Alexander the Great. With the political and financial patronage of his former student, Aristotle established a school of his own, the Lyceum.
He would walk around talking to his students. They were called the peripatetics, from the Greek word for walking around, walking and talking about biology, about astronomy, about politics, about ethics. Yeah, we're told that Aristotle, the man, was skinny, was bald, he might even have been bow-legged. He was not that impressive as a physical specimen, but he had a charisma that came straight from his intellect, that captivated everybody he talked to.
It was during his years at the Lyceum, while engaging with curious young minds, that Aristotle made his most important contributions to Western thought, suggesting not only what to think, but how to think. He did this by creating the science of logic, which sought to organize the undisciplined thinking that was common in his day.
It's in Aristotle, for the very first time in the history of the West, and that we find the development of logic, that is a formal system of rules for evaluating whether an argument works, whether it doesn't work, whether it's a good argument or a bad argument.
A building block of Aristotle's logic was a form of argument called a syllogism.
In the ancient world, the philosophers used to like simple examples of syllogism to illustrate logic. You know, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
What seemed like a simple form of argument was in fact a tremendous tool. When applied to complex questions, the syllogism could yield great insights. Today, the tools of logic, though often invisible, are critical to our lives. They are used by lawyers to win cases, by computer programmers to write code. But back in the 4th century BC, Aristotle used the tools of logic to investigate less logical questions of human nature. He turned his focus to the field of ethics.
We've come to think of ethics as being all about staying out of trouble. We live in a culture where people think about not so much what you do, but whether you get caught, whether it's speeding or whether it's jaywalking. The ancient thinkers thought much more deeply. The great philosophers of the past thought of ethics not as being about staying out of trouble. The ancient philosophers believed that ultimately ethics is the foundation for excellence.
For Aristotle, excellence and virtue came not from striving for unattainable ideals, but from our ability to live a happy life.
Happiness comes to be the central concept in Aristotle's philosophy of human nature and human activity. And happiness is connected with excellence. Happiness is a form of activity. Aristotle said. You have to be a participant in this world, using all of your talents in accordance with excellence. Then, he said, you attain happiness.
The surest path to excellence was living life in moderation and subscribing to something Aristotle called the golden mean. For Aristotle, every virtue was the middle ground between two extremes. Between the vices of cowardice and rashness lies the virtue of courage. Between lethargy and revelry lies poise. And between humility and pride, there is modesty.
In any situation, there are extreme ways of reacting, and there is a balanced way of reacting. The happy person will be the person who applies this golden mean thinking in every possible situation.
Anybody can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person, and to the right degree, and at the right time, and for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power and is not easy.
Aristotle wants to know what kinds of desires, passions, emotions should a good person have. And it's this much broader question that explores the psychology of the individual human agent that makes Aristotle's ethics very much alive today.
Now there's a revolution of coming back to Aristotle's understanding of ethics as having to do with people and their characters.
While Aristotle's work on ethics encouraged people to live virtuous lives, some of his other writings on human nature were far more troubling. Aristotle believed in a hierarchy of souls. He felt that some people's souls were diminished, leaving them unfit to govern themselves, while other people's souls were fully intact, making them natural rulers. This hierarchy was used to rationalize slavery and justify horrendous cruelty for thousands of years.
It is clear that some men are by nature free, and others slaves, and that for the latter slavery is both expedient and right. All would acknowledge, then, that the inferior class should be slaves of the superior.
Aristotle's views on slavery are quite disappointing. Greece, and Athens in particular, unfortunately at this time, was a slave society. Aristotle held slaves, as did Plato. It was quite the norm for better-off Greeks to do so.
We have to understand Aristotle, like Plato, like Socrates, like every other great thinker, was a person of his time. He had prejudices. He wasn't right about everything. I think people approach philosophy wrong when they think of the great philosophers of the past as oracles of truth and wisdom. The great philosophers of the past were just people like you and me, trying to figure it all out.
Over the course of his life, Aristotle authored more than 150 treatises. Titles included On the Sciences, On the Soul, On Plants, On Animals, On Motion, On Wealth. No field of thought escaped his grasp. The young man who had come to Athens more than 40 years earlier searching for knowledge had become an intellectual force in his own right. But in 323 BC, Aristotle's world was shaken to its core. At the age of 33, Alexander the Great unexpectedly died.
On the death of Alexander, Athens revolted from Alexander, as did much of Greece. It became a very dangerous time to be a friend of Alexander's in Athens.
Fearing for his life, Aristotle fled to the island of Euboea. Months later, alone and in exile, he died at the age of 62. For thousands of years after his death, Aristotle's ideas would be expanded on, modified, and in some cases rejected outright. But they would always serve as a point of reference and a foundation on which to build.
You have to dig deep. You have to wade through a lot. Aristotle was a very technical thinker, a very technical writer. And yet, if you put in the time, if you're willing to go to the trouble, you find insights that can change the way you think about everything.
Aristotle's legacy can be found less in his specific teachings and more in his unending desire to understand the world.
I think Aristotle's most important legacy is the approach that he recommends to you. Deep reflection on yourself, on the world around you, and your relations with other people, and thinks that engaging in this sort of deep and sustained reflection is part of what it is to lead a human life.
We must not listen to those who urge us to think human thoughts, since we are human, and mortal thoughts, since we are mortal. Rather, we should, as far as possible, immortalize ourselves and do all we can to live by the finest element in us. It is far greater than anything else in power and truth.